Kia ora koutou whānau. Welcome back to another edition of Big Hairy News, a pre-recorded conversation that was recorded earlier in the week. And it's all about the Atlas Network. It's quite funny. I also put out a clip of a conversation that me and Chewy had where we were talking about the response that we're getting from people, like, for example, talking about anyone who questions the Atlas Network as a conspiracy theorist. And that thread on Twitter is just full of people calling me a conspiracy network. So it's kind of, I don't know, is it a self-fulfilling prophecy or it's evidence as to what was said is actually true? Not sure. But the conversation tonight is about an hour and a quarter, hour and 20, give or take, and it's all about the Atlas Network. Now, it's with an academic, and there is some deep thoughts in this as well. Not so much of the joking around that you get with me and Chewy, but it's dense with information. It may even be dense enough with information that you might want to watch it twice. You know, like how you watch something and then you watch back again and you get some other thing that you missed first time around. It is dense with information. Really good chat though. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Lots of opportunity to learn from our guest. And before we do that, let's just say a huge thanks to our patrons who are with us and who have been with us for a long time. I'll say at the time of recording this conversation, these were our patrons. That may have changed by the time this is actually broadcasting. But at the time of recording, thank you to our patrons. Thank you for being a part of what we do. If you want to come and help support what we do, maybe be involved in the next conversation around Atlas, then you can do that by heading to patreon.com/Big Hairy News. Patreon.com/Big Hairy News. Cool bananas. All right, let's get into it. Coming up next, we have a conversation recorded earlier this week all about the Atlas Network. From the University of Technology in Sydney, the School of Communication in the Social and Political Sciences program, we welcome to the show Dr. Jeremy Walker. J-Man, Jeremy, Jezza, how are you, man?
Good, mate. Thanks for having me on, Pat.
Yeah, looking forward to this actually, because we've got you on to talk about the Atlas Network, yeah? And thank you for coming on, because for many of us, it's quite a new concept. These words, Atlas Network, weren't around necessarily for most people's ears, maybe even a month ago, but let's say 6 months ago. And now it's been spoken about by everyone. One side of the political spectrum seems to be saying, oh, look at this conspiracy theory, you leftist lunatics. And the other side of the political spectrum is going, look at these people puppeteering right-wing talking points around the world. So I don't know if you'd consider yourself an expert in it, but you're certainly a published academic and author on it. So I thought, good man to get on and have a bit of a chat about the whole thing. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Well, look, I mean, no, most people haven't heard of it, and that's quite intentional. But many of people will have heard the word neoliberal or neoliberalism.
Yep.
And so that's what, and there's a lot of academic work out there on that topic, because this has been the dominant framework, if you like, for thinking about, or, you know, the most powerful story about how to organize national and international political economy since the late 1970s or something like that.
Uh-huh.
Those ideas about, you know, the idea that we can't have, if we look, it goes back to the 30s. I'll try and be very brief about it, but back in the 30s, you had, for one thing, universal suffrage becomes a norm around the world. And going even back further, which we won't go into detail about, but mainly that was won by people striking in the fossil fuel industry, right? It was coal workers, railway workers, dock workers, all went on strike for universal suffrage, and they won those rights for men first, and women came later in Europe. Australia and New Zealand, of course, have a pretty good record of early universal suffrage. But anyway, the 1930s, you have the Depression hits, and all of a sudden people are demanding that government step in to protect ordinary people from, the crises that came out of the stock market, for example, in 1929. And so one of the key figures here is a fellow called Friedrich von Hayek, a sort of low-level noble from the Austrian Empire, servant of the ruling class in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And people gathered around him. And they're very worried about the Lord Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, who shows through a practical example that, it's quite possible for governments to step in make sure that we don't have mass unemployment, to create income and wage policies and expenditure and fiscal policies which create a relatively egalitarian society and prevent this drastic boom and bust cycle, which is normal. And so when they call themselves classical liberals, you'll see that the Atlas Network people always like to do that. Classical liberals refers back to the late 19th century when there was no democracy and there was no regulation of corporate activity. When the whole of India, for example, and what's now Pakistan, Bangladesh, were all being run by a single corporation, the British East India Company. And so when they say classical liberal, believe them, because they, as I show in my book, that philosophy can be really dated back to the Irish famine in the 1830s. We had the first, liberal economics government in England, and then that idea that the government shouldn't intervene, even when people are involved in mass starvation and they're exporting bacon and beef and food from Ireland to other markets, that the government had no obligation to step in and help people who are under mass starvation in Ireland. And in India, we have a situation even more drastic where you have, depending on which figures you look at, hundreds of millions of people dying of famine during the British Raj, and they're still exporting food from Mumbai and from Calcutta. Because what they mean by freedom is that government shouldn't protect ordinary people from profit-seeking activities of wealthy people and corporations. So that's the freedom bit. But the Mont Pelerin Society forms in after the war as a kind of organization, a kind of semi-secret, invite-only debating club of professors and liberal economists. And right from the beginning, those meetings were supported, and Hayek's career as the most important philosopher of neoliberalism were supported by grants from the fossil fuel industry, from the Rockefeller Foundation, which was Standard Oil money, and Standard Oil is now more or less ExxonMobil. So that history goes right back into the very beginning of this counter-reaction or counter-revolution against social democracy. So the Atlas Network was...
Just pause there for a sec. Sorry, not to interrupt you. Just to give people a bit of a heads up as we're going along. There is another podcast or interview out there at the moment on the UTS page. And you go into this history as you're talking through now for us in an elevator pitch. And I think you take like 30 minutes to go through it. So if people want to look up Central News, UTS, the Atlas Network, Big Oil, Climate Disinformation and Constitutional Democracy, I will put the link in the description of the video as well. But you're giving us kind of the, not necessarily layman's, but the abridged version. But if people want to know more about it, they can go there, they can listen to this link in the description, and they will find out a whole heap more. You expand on it a lot more in there as well. So sorry, you were saying into the Atlas Network.
Yeah, go ahead. Well, look, and so it was, you had this sort of group that was very self-conscious of being marginalized and thought of as, right-wing radicals and insane and so on. They didn't get much traction. Of course, they were popular with big business, particularly big international businesses that didn't want to deal with national parliaments, right? They wanted smooth space at the international level where they're not likely to have to worry about what national parliaments wanting to put wages up or, have a border, have tariffs or customs duties or, regulate those industries. And of course, this gets much more important in the 1970s when at the same time you have this kind of global movement all around the world. But certainly in the Arab world and North Africa, and as also in Australia, England, and Canada, you have these efforts of those countries to nationalize oil resources and other mineral resources. And so this is really when things kick off. And the first think tank, so those ideas would have probably remained quite marginal and not taken very seriously until a chap called Anthony Fisher appears on the scene. Sir Anthony Fisher was knighted by Thatcher. Oh. And he, and again, I'll try not to repeat what's in that other seminar that you just pointed to, but basically he came from the British ruling class. Again, his parents came from a family of mine owners and politicians, went to Eton and Cambridge, to the elite schools, and was horrified after World War II, where he was a pilot in the Battle of Britain, that the British people had voted in the socialist government of the Labour Party under Clement Attlee, who promptly nationalised all the fossil fuel infrastructure, coal, gas, steel, as well as railways, and then also on the basis of that to build the National Health Service and the cradle to grave welfare state. So this was a disaster for people of that class.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I know that New Zealand, I think around that time, had one of the most comprehensive welfare states as well, dating from that period. Yeah, and so, but they wouldn't have got very far until the think tank was invented. It was the think tank. The very first one was the Institute of Economic Affairs, founded in London in 1955 by Anthony Fisher, who joined this club of, you know, economists and writers and philosophers, journalists. It also included a few ex-aristocrats from, you know, pretenders to the Austrian throne, and a couple of very wealthy American businessmen who they couldn't, you know, they didn't want to have business people in there, partly because it was bad optics, because they wanted to look like they were independent academics. And anyway, Fisher develops this thing called the Institute of Economic Affairs, and what they did was to just basically dumb down and condense what these professors of economics, of liberal economics, who were really upset about, you know, decolonization in the third world, for example. They didn't like that. And the reason they were upset, and so he was able to put together this thing, and his job was to just push out as much content as possible. You know, whether it was like easy to read books pitched at, you know, first year students, right? Nothing too complicated. Yep. Op-eds for the newspapers, radio interviews. So they're always ready to go with this stuff to flood the public sphere with what looked like respectable professors saying things. But they never said who was paying for it. And and to this day,
sounds familiar, Jeremy. Sounds familiar to what happens in the cycles of politics today. Information coming out, not sure the money behind it. Polls coming out, not sure where they've come from. Doesn't sound like much has changed.
Well, what has changed is that, you know, and you know, it's, you know, we now know that right from the early 60s, they got their first big corporate backers for the IEA, Shell, based in, you know, which is basically, you know, next to ExxonMobil, has been and always has been the largest and most global private oil company in the world. Rio Tinto, which is, you know, British-owned mining giant, at the time monopolized the uranium trade, for example, as well as they're involved in oil and gas. So, and they very collected this huge subscription of you know, global companies, which were on the backbone, if you like, of the British Empire all through Africa and so on, but also increasingly American companies as well, and banks and so on. But particularly, it was Shell, BP, and Rio Tinto, I think, who were the big backers early on. And this was so successful that Margaret Thatcher has said that it was the IEA that created, in a nice term, the climate of opinion, which made her election possible.
Right. Wow.
Yeah.
So this money coming from places like fossil fuels and petrol and oil back in the day, we're still seeing that flow through today. So that's the history of the Atlas Network, abridged history. As I said, go to that other podcast or that other seminar to hear about it.
1981, Fisher founds this thing called the Atlas Network.
Right.
Basically, because he keeps getting these invitations to set up new think tanks by business figures. Often, you know, for example, you know, someone perhaps, we don't know if the first one was the Fraser Institute in Canada. And, you know, Shell, you know, Canada would, you know, meet someone from Shell UK, and they'd say, oh, have you heard about this Fisher guy? I don't know how it happened, but he'd get these invitations from very wealthy businesses and large corporations to set up a kind of clone of the IEA. It's so effective at changing public opinion.
Right.
And that was Fraser 1974. Then they set up the Centre for Independent Studies in Sydney in 1976, which is crucial because this is where the New Zealand Atlas Network comes from, the CIS. And then he's in so much demand, by 1981, he sets up this other organization called the Atlas Economic Research Foundation. And its job is not to be a think tank itself, but to be the mother of all think tanks. So to sort of mass manufacture and roll out hundreds of these worldwide. So we go from
sort of head office for all the other think tanks.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. In a word, we don't know how centralized the control is, but certainly, none of the think tanks go off message. They don't start calling for a carbon tax, or they don't go off and start calling for more funding for public schools, or they don't go around saying we need, robust antitrust policy to break up corporate monopolies. They always stay on track, on the right. They hit the right lines, maybe from different ways to different audiences, but they keep repeating those lines.
One of the things we hear about the Atlas Network from people who are kind of saying, oh, it's just conspiracy theorists, is they don't have any money invested in New Zealand. What you're describing, though, sounds like a very large organisation. Is there any information out there as to what the whole thing costs to run, like from the head office farming out all these think tanks? And do we have any idea at all what kind of value they put into all of this think tankerage over the years?
Look, it's a very good question. I mean, I think it's been very interesting to see now that the news is traveling. I mean, and it's very interesting and exciting in a way, because Aotearoa, New Zealand, is the first country in the world that I know of. I mean, I'm not there in, so, from 1981 to the present, there's been an expansion of the number of think tanks that are, partner organizations, as they call them. That used to be up on the Atlas Network website, but then they pulled all that information down as soon as people started to study it. Right. There's now 500 to 600 of these around the world, and in 100 countries. So I can't say that we need a lot more research capacity than we currently have mobilized to fully discover exactly what's going on in every country they are in.
But even if those think tanks aren't driving money into the economy that they're on, if they're focusing on, as you said, quote, changing public opinion, that's still 500 think tanks being run is a huge amount of money. Even if the money's not going from the think tank into the community they're in, it's going to be millions, if not tens of millions, surely.
Well, this is what was very interesting. So now that this and the secret of the success has been that, on the one hand, and I'll get to your question about the money in a sec, but the key thing is that each think tank is set up in such a way as ideally they will say nothing about where their money's coming from.
Right.
So that's crucial. And as I quote John Bonython, who was the founder of the massive gas giant Santos, which is just enormous and kind of unstoppable in Australia now. But the founder of that corporation, who was founded in collaboration with a Texas oil billionaire, the Murchison family, in the 60s, went back to the 50s, but he was the one that invited Fisher to Australia to set up this think tank by going around in private meetings to all of the billionaires and heads of major international corporations here in Australia. And what Bonython says in a letter which I managed to obtain to an oil baron, one of the rich oil men from Texas, he says, we've tried to get the message out to the public through chambers of commerce and things like this, and peak bodies like the Petroleum Association, or whatever. But people immediately write this off as vested interest.
Yeah,
of course you would say that because you're the oil industry. Of course you would say climate change is real, or that we shouldn't have a carbon tax because you're the oil industry. But what Bonython says in that letter is that Fisher's method is much more effective. What he does, he has a way of getting academics to say things and write things in their own names, which we can't say for ourselves. Right? So the idea was basically they found this group, and those academics were all members of the Mont Pelerin Society. But that was also not declared. So you had one group of academics who are all in this sort of, very well supported international group where they fly around and meet in fancy hotels from Vienna to, all around the world every year. They meet at least once. And then they set up a thing called the Atlas Network, which meets in parallel with those meetings at least once a year, for the first 20 or 30 years. And the heads of each think tank are usually members of the Mont Pelerin Society. These are the most trusted insiders of the organization. So it's kind of an inner sanctum, if you like. But yeah, in terms of the funding, in New Zealand, you've had this thing, it's a conspiracy. Well, no, it's not, because, all I'm quoting is their own evidence. They've spent the last, 40 years pumping this content out into every channel, whether it's university bookshops, high school curriculum, which they design and push into the teachers' teaching spaces, whether it's radio interviews, whether it's, they're up there, whenever there's a government inquiry, they're like filling it with their own submissions.
Yeah.
They've got YouTube channels, they've got Twitter streams, they're everywhere, right? And all you've got to believe, all you have to do is see that, well, these think tanks, which are supposed to be independent, are actually all part of the same entity. And that doesn't mean that there is one guy in a room at George Mason, Charles Koch, for example, telling everyone what to do. There is some degree of decentralization, but we see these campaigns being rolled out across the whole network, right? And the key one is, and I've got all the references in those papers. 1988, the petroleum industry, 1988, the public becomes aware of the climate change, right? They know that suddenly it becomes public knowledge that we're heading towards an absolute catastrophe. And in 1988, there's a meeting in Toronto conference, where world leaders and scientists get together and say, yeah, we need to have to reduce emissions by 20% of the global total by the year 2005 as a starter. And then we have to keep cutting, right? And we need a binding treaty, and we need defined national reduction targets, and they all have to be legislated in law. And we have to start shrinking the fossil fuel industry now. That's 1988. And there's a letter a few days later that, which you can find on Climate Files. It's a very valuable site of internal oil industry documents that shows they knew everything there was to know about catastrophic climate change going back to like mid-1950s now. They knew everything there was to know about it, but they never told the public. When the public became aware, there's an Exxon executive, there's an internal memo, he says, the position of the petroleum industry through the American petroleum industry, which is lobby for all the big oil companies in the world, will be that the science of climate change is uncertain. Right?
So, for clarity,
roll that out.
The fossil fuel industry knew about this.
Yeah, right.
They kept it to themselves, and when it became public, they started pushing back against the information that they'd already known to themselves.
Yeah, that's right. They then proceeded to tell 15 different flavors of lies about that it wasn't real, or it wouldn't be that bad, or we have to wait a few more years to do more research, but that, we definitely shouldn't have a carbon tax because, their own research showed that would work. So they've attacked carbon taxes everywhere, including Australia. They said, we'll bury the carbon underground in, carbon capture and storage, or we'll have a market which will trade rights to pollute or not pollute, and we'll offset forests against, all of this stuff actually came from the industry itself, and then was sold to the public through the think tanks. So, that's just looking at oil. Obviously, there's other aspects to it. They wanted to get rid of public education because they didn't like that. They wanted to get rid of unions. They wanted to get rid of particularly teachers' unions. They want to get rid of public health. And you're seeing this all across the board now with the sort of shock and awe policies that the current government is doing. They're attacking all of these things at once to create, to destabilize society, to remove resources from people they see as their enemies. And so on.
It's one of my sort of questions. One of the things I want to get from you is, what is their end game? Now, I do want to talk about The Voice, and I do want to talk about the Atlas Network in New Zealand, obviously, as well. But what is their end game? And it just sounds like, from what you're saying, their end game is to make as much profit as they can for as long as possible. And so it doesn't matter what else has to be pushed aside, lied about, put underground, exaggerated, falsified. Is the end game just, please, more money in my pocket? And when it's that, more money in my pocket, is it an individual? Is it like, who? When I say who is the Atlas Network, I know you've just explained what they do and stuff, but it's not a Rockefeller sitting on the top anymore, but who is it? Is it a multi-conglomerate? Is it an organization? Does it have key people? And is it just about making money? Is that really what it's all about? Just making as much money as possible, be damned the environment, be damned everything else?
Yeah, basically. I mean, look, it's hard for me to say what motivates people who have... so, for example, two key figures in setting up the Atlas from the start, and basically they brought the whole neoliberal ideology, the radical Austrian right-wing ideology of Friedrich von Hayek and von Mises, which was just seen as, like, by most professional economists, even economists within the Montpellier Society, like Milton Friedman, just thought they were kind of really, like they go so far as to say that there is no empirical evidence that can be used to support or
I was going to say, was it so? This was too much for Friedman, was it? There was too much for Friedman. The kind of example that everyone uses about a free economy and free trading of goods and capital. It was like, no, guys, it's a bit far. It's a bit far, that, guys.
Yeah. So there was even a split within the Montpellier Society between the economists like Friedman, who thought you could use data and time series data and say, well, look, here are the effects. If we change, this is what the central bank policy should be if we look at what happens. So he believed that there was empirical support for the free market policies. So although he didn't care about democracy and he didn't care about the environment, and he was quite happy to have zero corporate tax and no public ownership, no public defense of land. But even he thought that the Austrians were just so radical in that they quite literally say this, that economics has nothing to do with the material world. There doesn't, we can't, if we're talking about economics, we're not allowed to talk about steel or food or land or corn or anything like that. It's purely about these market signals, and they explicitly say that you can't use the actual facts of nature and the empirical world to talk about what economics is. So it was Charles Koch who really put lots of money into bringing this, as I said, very marginal, obscure view of the world. And now it's mainstreamed into the US. And they built that whole edifice of sort of glorifying this very strange worldview. And the other thing that is a corollary of that is because you're not allowed to do anything to influence prices, that is taxes, corporate regulation, minimum wages, tariffs, sin taxes, and carbon taxes, any of this stuff which just seems so logical to your average economist who isn't one neoliberal. They've created this entire cult around it. And so, Charles and David Koch, they inherited a huge fortune. Their father was built oil refineries. They would be, if you took them together, just those two individuals, they would be the richest person in the world.
Yeah.
Another big backer was Richard Mellon Scaife, who's deceased now, but he backed them from the beginning. And likewise, his family, the Scaife family, they owned the Mellon banks. They owned Alcoa, the global aluminium monopoly. They owned Gulf Oil, which was later absorbed into Chevron. That family was at one time in the top 10 richest people in the world. 4 of them were members of the Scaife family. So we're talking about people who are extremely, extremely rich and owned the most destructive industries in the world. So they don't care if we live or die. If they did, they wouldn't have been lying about climate change. I think that's the point at which we, rather than knowing why they do it, the fact that they are willing to allow the Earth to become progressively uninhabitable, and that they knew that this was the case. They built up an entire infrastructure to deceive the public about this, and at the same time to infiltrate government and disable all of the key powers that a government has to protect its citizens from corporations. So this is why
it makes sense a little bit when you talk about the classic liberal title and the Koch brothers as well, because where I hear classic liberal is from the American right. Like where I hear people saying I'm a classic liberal, it's the Tucker Carlsons, it's it's these people who are in and of themselves associated with the Koch brothers through funding at some stage in their point, through Rupert Murdoch, whatever it is. So there seems to be at least a connecting line there between people who want to define themselves as classic liberals and the Koch brothers in America, where I'm hearing that term get used from.
Well, they invented the term neoliberal because they wanted to distance themselves from the impression of laissez-faire capitalism, which is there's no regulations, there's no protection for anyone, and that was and that what they wanted to do was, and the idea of laissez-faire is just leave us alone. The merchants and the capitalists say just leave us alone. But for Hayek, and that was too passive, and he wanted an activist, passionate advocacy for unregulated global capitalism. This, of course, was why the corporations that were the most global, that is, oil industry and banking behind the oil industry, that was what they wanted to project as well into the public sphere. So the think tank network was there to produce the ideas, saturate the public discourse with ideas that these massive corporations and extremely, extremely rich individuals want the public to believe.
Yeah.
And then, push the story ever to the right. Okay. So you've heard of the concept of the Overton window?
Yep. Mm-hmm. Do you want to give us the 20 seconds on that for people who haven't?
Oh yeah, you can keep me on time. If you want to direct me to other things, do so. But I'm happy.
Oh no, I'm just saying for people who are listening who haven't heard about the Overton window, just give us the title of what that is.
Okay, so there was a character called Joseph Overton who worked for one of the Atlas think tanks in the US, and he basically come up with this way of talking about what it is that the think tanks do. Now, the idea is that they just basically repeat the same things over and over again, but keep on saying by saying things which at one point seemed just so extreme that no one would take it seriously. Over time, you keep saying it, and if it's said from over here, there's an institute over here called the Institute of Political. Oh, there's another one over there that's called what's that one called? It's something very boring. Center for Independent Studies. Sounds like a university research center. So the whole point was to basically push genuine academic scholarly knowledge out of the public sphere and replace it with their own pseudo research institutes, which were basically pushing stories favorable to their hidden backers in a very synchronized way, so the public can't see. Yeah. So, sorry, did you want to? Oh, yeah. So the Overton window. So Overton window is basically, you see this, how it works is we see this. So, for example, you'll see this in the way that they set up multiple think tanks within a country. So if we have a look at New Zealand, you've got the New Zealand Initiative, which its roots are in, ultimately go back to the New Zealand branch of the Centre for Independent Studies, which was established by Alan Gibbs out of Sydney in the mid-80s, and the New Zealand Business Roundtable, which was another organisation set up by the same people. All your favourite people like Roger Douglas, who's a member of the Mont Pelerin Society, were involved in that. Also involved later on in, as far as, at least you can read this on Wikipedia, in setting up the ACT Party.
Yep.
And Overton window is you just keep saying extreme things over and over again until they become normal. Right?
Yeah.
So here in Australia, you'll have the Taxpayers Union will be just saying, we'll be trying to, it's well documented that they were driving the whole assault on the, Parliament through the Voices for Freedom, counterspin, using that audience of counterspin. I don't know the connection with counterspin if there is one, but just saying really radical stuff, or supporting people who say that and pushing them to say more of it, we've got to get to Rio Maori, all the signs are too hard to read, and communists are destroying the farms and the electric, and they take, a proposal to encourage the uptake of electric vehicles becomes a car tax and a ute tax. This is all stuff that they've used here in Australia a few years before, and they rolled it out.
Yeah.
Over there. So you'll have one, and here it's the Institute of Public Affairs, which says just insane things all the time, like climate change isn't real, or it's a conspiracy of the United Nations to take over our freedom, like really radical, crazy stuff. But they just say it over and over again, and it becomes normal. And what that means is then when their people get into power, they can say, we need to restore balance, and they'll shift things a little bit over. They won't go the whole way, but they'll go a little bit further that way. That's the Overton window. And the other thing that is part of that is also infiltrating and getting inside organizations and changing their processes. So if you look at where the organizations where you find Mont Pelerin Society members or people who have a track record working for another think tank. So to give you an example, in New Zealand, you have, I won't say his name, but a fellow who was recently employed as the public relations and communications officer at what used to be called Petroleum Exploration and Production New Zealand, is now called Energy Aotearoa. So they've removed the reference to petroleum. And
it's like Kentucky. It's like Kentucky Fried Chicken not wanting to use the word fried anymore, so they're KFC.
Exactly. So they kind of, they've done the same thing in Australia. What used to be called the Petroleum Exploration Association is now called Energy Australia. So it's about energy now. We're not talking about petroleum. We're talking about energy. That could be solar panels, right?
Could be.
So they kind of constantly changing the way they describe themselves. Anyway, so the guy that was the PR guy there also worked with the Taxpayers Union and also worked for the New Zealand Initiative, the two, known Atlas Network think tanks in New Zealand. And now I believe the same guy is the press secretary in the office, the Minister for Energy's office, in Simeon Brown's office. So they have this ability to kind of, not only shape public opinion and public discourse by even if you don't agree with them, they start the fights, and then we go and talk about, so here in Australia, for example, we have to talk about uranium and why we need nuclear reactors. That whole debate takes up all the oxygen for what should really be being discussed, which is how quickly can we shut down the fossil fuel industry and replace it all with wind and solar.
Hey, I'm interested as well. If this is all about money, I get it if you're a Koch brother. What about the guys who are running the think tanks? Because they're not going to be worth tens, hundreds of millions of dollars. Do they just become useful idiots, or what's in it for them? Like, let's say an imaginary think tank in New Zealand. Let's call it the Pax Tayers Union. It's a made up imaginary place. If someone was to run that and be, associated with, funded by, advised by this group, which was the Natless network, what's in it for that person or those people running that? Is it they it's still about money for them? They just get it's a salary, because the Koch brothers might make tens, hundreds, billions of dollars, whatever. But what about the guys on the bottom?
It's a good question. It's one that I don't like to speculate on too much, because for me, what I do, my job is to tell the truth, to find out the truth, verify it, and then tell the truth and make it public. What I want out of life is, very different. Like, I don't want the barrier reef to die. I want the rivers to be able to drink the water from the rivers and to, for them to be full of fish. I want my children to be able to enjoy living on Earth. But these things are, I don't know. I guess it must, if I were to say anything to that, I would just say there's something about the thrill of actually causing events to happen and, thwarting your enemies
power. Maybe that will be the power of being the person that helps to change public opinion. That word you used earlier. And then that would obviously turn into potentially other employment opportunities, like working in Simeon Brown's office, and that could flow down. You become a player. You become a player in the world of politics.
Yeah, they're very carefully trained and vetted. So if we look at some of the key players in New Zealand. Mr. Williams, who, hi Jordan, if you're watching, we're great friends. Anyway,
I didn't mention anyone by name, Jeremy. I just had an imaginary union that came off the top of my lips.
Well, again, we should probably call it the not New Zealand non-taxpayers non-union, because one, it's they just like to disguise themselves in the language of national interest.
Yeah.
But how is it in New Zealand's national interest to upend the treaty? How is it in New Zealand's national interest to overturn the Resource Management Act? How is it in their national interest to reverse all of the progress that was made in the previous government about decarbonisation, the moratorium on oil and gas? It's not in New Zealand's interest. That's in the interest of corporate profit making. And a lot of that will be non-New Zealand capital that's invested in the country or hopes to be invested in the country.
But the other thing about the profit, though, that's interesting about the profit is we're talking about these companies with trillions or hundreds of billions of dollars. What's an extra $10 billion that you can earn out of ruining a country's, foreshore and seabed? It's like, I remember, I think it's Mr. Burns off The Simpsons talks about you get to a certain amount of wealth and then after that it's just ivory back scratches. If you've got billions, you don't need to now ruin the lives of other people by wrecking their fisheries and to get a third billion on top or whatever it is.
Again, I have no idea because I've never been rich, so I don't understand why they. But I think in the case of New Zealand, I think it's less about direct profit interest, perhaps, because yes, you do have offshore oil and gas. Yes, you do have possible seabed mining opportunities. These things are highly resisted, and particularly, we're seeing now there's litigation on the basis of Waitangi rights from traditional owners, Maori traditional owners in the Northland, using their rights as Indigenous people, and within the treaty, but also under international human rights law to block new projects. And the fact is that New Zealand, the point I think is often may well be that the point is that we cannot allow any resistance to be successful. So if we see
squash everything, squash any kind of back chat, any kind of pushback must be squashed, because that could be the start of something.
If New Zealand New Zealand can block offshore gas, then maybe other countries might try it. If New Zealand's can institute a kind of plurinational, bilingual, post-colonial state where the Indigenous people have an equal partnership with everybody else, where they're respected, and most importantly, where, like, if we look at what they want is just pure property rights, and in pure property rights, that includes the ability to destroy land.
Right.
It's my property. I'm going to destroy it. I'm going to cut everything down and poison
Do
the
what I
rivers.
want.
My property. Whereas Indigenous collective title is the antithesis of that. It says this is our land. It's always been ours. But more than that, it's not ours in a possessive sense. We have the obligation to honor our ancestors who cared for this country and to pass it on abundant and clean and pure and not sullied to our descendants. This is the opposite of the worldview that they want. And so when you see things like, that your country has set the tone for, compared to Australia, which is just shameful how far behind we are on this stuff. You have the Whanganui River is a person in law, a person with rights. Now, this is terrifying to the fossil capitalists because the idea of a sacred, non-negotiable protection of the environment, what they want to do is, privatize everything so they can, exploit and destroy that country. The same thing with the atmosphere, same thing with the waters, same thing with the privatization of the water system. You're seeing.
Talk to me about now. I want to talk about ACT for a couple of things. One of the ones I want to talk to you about is the actual interview that David Seymour had with Mihinarangi Forbes, where he went very pale when he was, and his eyes got very wide when he started to be asked questions about the Atlas Network. But before we do that, because you've just mentioned about Indigenous rights, the ACT Party here in New Zealand have this treaties principle bill at the moment. I mean, is this just I guess what I'm wondering is, because you were here to talk about the Atlas Network, is there a connection you can see? Is there a connection that is available? Do we know that there's a connection there? Or is this ACT doing something themselves that, it might align with the Atlas Network's desires, but not really? It's just ACT doing ACT stuff, and it might make some people happy. I mean, how do we know what is directed, advised by, paid for by these guys? And how do we know what's just, a quote right-wing neoliberal party being a right-wing neoliberal party?
Okay, well, again, it's difficult to know because we don't know the degree of how there is coordination, between the Atlas think tanks in New Zealand, between New Zealand Initiative and Taxpayers Union. But we do know, like I mentioned, like going back to, so it's difficult to say, but, it's not hard. I mean, I'd say the first place to look would be the corporate membership of Energy Aotearoa. Now, that has all the local small cap oil and gas companies. The big majors like Chevron and Exxon and BP, they like to pull their branding off everything now, right? But if you look at the history of the development of both the domestic petrol industry and also the offshore exploration and extraction industry, you'll see those names there going back in time.
Are they? Is this the guys we're talking about?
Yeah, that's them. So if you have a look at that, I mean, I don't know about this Atlas thing there. That's got nothing to do with it as far as I know, but it's a coincidence. But if you have a look, I mean, Bell Gully is very important to look at. Now, Bell Gully is a law firm. Now, why is Bell Gully on the petroleum lobby? Well, that's very interesting. Now, not only are they on the petroleum lobby, I believe that Nicola Willis's father is also a corporate lawyer with Bell Gully.
Really?
Okay. Yeah, and who has argued, I believe, and again, I'm just relying on third-hand sources here, so go and check yourselves. But I understand that he was involved in arguing, bringing cases against the moratorium on offshore prospecting brought in by Jacinda Ardern's government. It gets even more interesting if we look at Bell Gully. Bell Gully, one of the principals of Bell Gully in the past has been a gentleman by the name of Roger Partridge, who's a member of the Mont Pelerin Society and is one of the senior, I believe, the chair of the New Zealand Initiative. Now, Bell Gully, if you have a look, they are the sole advisor to the New Zealand government on the emissions trading scheme. Now, that's very interesting. So we have a company.
Sorry, just for clarity, the new current government, or they have been for a while, including the Labor-led government?
I'm not too sure. That's what it said on their website last I looked about a year ago.
Okay.
But there was Bell Gully that designed it, as far as I know, and wrote the legal, probably the legislation or advised on the legislation. And of course, that was brought in, I believe, I'm not sure exactly who was in government at the time, but basically it was, I think, it was a national conservative government. They had to have some climate policy, but the markets, the free market thing is, well, there's international offsets and there's no caps and there's compensation for polluters, and basically, and then they lowered the value. They basically printed so many of these certificates that they were more or less worth nothing on the open market. So they had almost zero impact at all on the fossil fuel industry in New Zealand. And isn't that a coincidence? We have people with a long association with the Atlas Network, embedded in the fossil fuel industry, designing the only. And then if you look at the communications that the Taxpayers Union and NZI do in the whole, I've been looking at that through the Ardern period, where there's these very bold initiatives around offshore moratorium, zero carbon act, electric cars. I mean, I believe they could have gone a lot faster when it came to actually producing primary energy from solar and wind, but I'm not an expert on that New Zealand's history there. But it's just interesting, you see all the Taxpayers Union stuff, they're going, oh, we can't have electric cars and it's a ute tax, and then they'll get people on from NZI and say, what do you think should be the first thing? Oh, we think the emissions trading scheme is all it needs to be done. Not everything else is just going to wreck the economy, but it was ineffective. And is that a coincidence?
It is. Are you saying that the TPU were the first people to bring out that saying the ute tax?
No, it came out in Australia.
Oh, so there was originated us, because now that's what everyone calls it. And I think that would be an example of what you're talking about the word gets used enough or a saying gets used enough. It becomes, I mean, it's like any legislation, I guess, gets a moniker that people want to know about.
But it's not a tax.
No.
No. I mean, here it was just, it goes back to the 2016 general election in Australia. And you had, the leader of the Labor opposition, Bill Shorten, said, we're going to, try and encourage the uptake of electric vehicles, because there was like zero infrastructure, right? Very modest statement. We're going to throw a few million at this, nothing big. That became the ute tax. They want to wreck your weekend by not letting you drive your ute on the weekend. That was like, what? Now, it gets even more interesting. There's a firm called Topham Gearan, who are a Stratcoms unit, which works, I think, very much. I mean, my impression is that they work at the intersection of the Atlas Network think tanks, the fossil fuel industry, and the Tory parties in Britain, Australia, and the UK. Now, it comes out that Topham Gearan are embedded in the Liberal Party government in the 2016 election, and we're coming out with all of this stuff. Like there's you can see it on the website of the Australian Taxpayers Association, one of the Australian think tanks. And they host an annual conference every year called the Milton Friedman Conference. So if you just look it up now, it's Friedman.
Is this Topham Gearan?
Friedman 19, Australian Taxpayers Alliance.
Is this the Topham Gearan group you're talking about?
Yeah, well, Ben Gearan's on a panel there. It's called Friedman 19, Using Social Media Effectively. And very interestingly, they say we were embedded in the Liberal Party and doing all their comms. And they came up with this thing like, inheritance, looking at inheritance taxes, which had been abolished. They were going to call that a death tax. And then they were trying to wind up a loophole, which means that people that own, retirees who own shares get, not only they don't get taxed, but they even get an extra payment from the tax department for owning the shares, which is a huge item on the Australian public budget that basically transfers money to the people who are already wealthy. That was called a retiree tax. And then they called the candidate Electricity Bill, because he was saying we're going to roll out renewable energy. So they called him Electricity Bill. And so you see this thing, interestingly, the ute tax appears over in New Zealand. Interesting. Now, Topham Gearan were also running Nationals, in the paper it was said that they were running the Nationals election campaign in the last election in New Zealand. I'm sure that they have Jordan on speed dial. That's just speculation. I don't know.
Before we move into our conversation around that Mihinarangi Forbes interview, just touching base to make sure we're finished off with the idea about the ACT referendum
Yeah,
trying to what we see as kind of negate the treaty. They're all talking about, it's not, we're not debating the treaty, we're debating the principles of the treaty, but what they're actually saying is we're debating the lens that we read the treaty through. In other words, if we change the principles of the treaty, we change how it's going to be operated and how it runs, then we're actually in turn changing how it's going to be operated with and how it works, sort of thing. Is there anything that you see or understand or can educate us on between the link between that and think tanks that the Atlas Network may or may not be involved with, or think tanks in general?
Yeah, well, look, I have to be a little careful here because I'm certainly not an expert on the constitutional law and procedures of your country. I would highly recommend you get some people on who are expert in that. But I'd say what's happening is that you've had this whole, so what, if we go back to, 2019, 2020, where you've got this whole, taxpayers union supporting this reaction from below, and quite deliberately cultivating the anti-vaxxers. So people who are, are not scientifically, perhaps scientifically literate, who are demonstrably vulnerable to disinformation, and then, creating a movement in some ways that wasn't there before, perhaps, or catalyzing that anger and focusing it and giving it a name and giving it targets and driving it along. So you already had this reaction, which probably wasn't there before, of people that suddenly it's okay to say we hate Te Reo Maori, and suddenly it's okay to, say, oh, we need to be equal and Maori have too many rights or whatever. And, and then they managed to attach to that anger, oh, electric cars, ute tax as well. Because they find they'll find anger.
Yeah.
And then they'll attach the things that they really want to that anger.
Yeah.
So here in
100%.
Australia, it's like, oh, trans people in women's sport, but then they'll link that to, oh, and the people, eventually you'll see them linking that back to, oh, woke solar panels, whatever, So they'll use they'll figure out to take that anger that's been cultivated in one issue and attach it to another one. But certainly that audience was there. But just to get really to your question, you've got someone in what I believe 8% of the vote wanting to overturn the Constitution of New Zealand.
That they wouldn't say it like that, but as I said, if you're going to change the principles of the treaty, that's basically how the treaty is to be used.
Well,
treaty I agree with you. I agree with you. That's what they're.
Are they asking iwi about that? Are they asking Maori leaders if they want this discussion? Are they including that?
And this is something we talk about a lot on this show, so we don't need to kind of go into it now. But it's very clear to me that if you've got a contract between two people, one group can't then just decide that everything's going to change. You have to do both signatories to the agreement have to go, okay, let's make up some new rules around our thing. And it's not even one signatory. It's actually it's one slice of the pie of one signatory, because only one party, maybe two, are asking for this, and combined they make up.
Before, where does it come from? I mean, you may know that better than me, but I mean, where has this story about the treaty's ruining everything? We've got to modify it. So, I mean,
where is it coming from? I mean, I don't want to be flippant, and I don't want to be flippant and make it a too easy, overreaching answer. But racism. I mean, people think. I mean, it's that old adage of, for people who have power, equality feels like oppression. So when you're being told you guys have had it pretty good for the last 170 years, and the other half of this agreement are in the worst statistical position of every metric in society, maybe we need to do something to make this more equal. What they think is, why should they get special privileges? And it's like, well, hang on, if Māori have all these special privileges and they're all getting these things that no one else is getting, why are they the bottom of every social statistic that we have? I mean, if I had all the privileges in the world, I don't think I'd be at the bottom of any social stats. I think I'd be at the top. So, and I think there's countries have a.
I think more so in Australia, like the same. We had this, and it was very interesting to me because they settled on one line. There's a very interesting article on the Centre for Independent Studies website by Warren Mundine, who's been cultivated as the sort of Indigenous face of the neoliberal think tank work. But obviously people don't know. So they just people see this guy on TV, Aboriginal guy on TV, saying, "Oh, we don't want this voice. We don't want this makarata. We don't want the things that have been called for out of a 5-year-long process of a national constitutional convention involving 260 Aboriginal nations, Torres Strait Islander nations, judges, historians, all coming together to agree what they want to ask of the Australian people in the Parliament." One fella gets up there and says, "No, Aboriginal people don't want this." And he, on the Centre for Independent Studies website, quite explicitly said, a voice in Parliament, if there was a body within the Parliament of, elected First Nations leaders who were there only to speak with unlike, you've got Maori seats in Parliament, they have voting rights, there's nothing like that was proposed here. But even that was too much. And he said quite explicitly on the website of the Centre for Independent Studies, which was founded by Santos, Shell, Rio, BHP, and is very quiet about their current funding, Aboriginal people will speak up against, specifically the Adani coal mine, James Price Point gas hub, and the Beetaloo Basin gas. And he quite explicitly says that. But then when they set up another organisation called, repurposed a sort of dormant letterbox address called Advance Australia, which then was renamed Fair Australia. And then they came out with all of this stuff about how it's unfair and it's unfair that Aboriginal people get, the position of Indigenous Australians is far worse when it comes to incarceration, poverty, lack of land ownership, all of those things, lack of voice, violence, but then they created this whole story about how it was unequal. And I was fascinated to see that exactly the same lines that was being run by this, front for the Atlas called Advance Australia, then immediately appeared on the ACT website on the same day as the referendum was defeated here.
Wow.
I saw the ACT website saying we need to end division by race.
And this is something, and I don't know if it's the same as you feel in Australia, but this is something, the ending division by race, that is David Seymour's catchphrase, right? Now,
exactly.
The problem, but the problem with that, the easy, and look, I've asked them to come on, and they won't come on my little pissant show. I don't know why, but maybe it's because of this.
I've asked them questions.
Is because he doesn't want equality based on any other protected class. He doesn't want equality based on sex, or based on age, or based on religion, or based on, all these things that are human rights protected class.
Well,
he only wants what he described as equality based on race. So we talk about this a lot. We're like, okay, so David, if you go and get equality for everything, you'd feel more authentic. So therefore, no more of those special car parks for the disabled people, because it's, there's a thing. No more only male priests for the Catholic Church. It's discrimination based on sex because of religious beliefs, because you can't do that. So if we're going to have equality, call for equality, but they're not. They're calling for equality only around race, and it's race baiting and feeding their base and getting them in, and it's dipping into that, the racist underbelly of a sector of society and getting them votes.
Yeah, and that's quite true. But they'll also be far more sophisticated than this. Because here in Australia, they had a whole story that was pitched at, your traditional Anglo racists, but they were always going to vote against it anyway.
Yeah.
But what was much more interesting was how they managed to convince people that wanted to do the right thing by First Nations to vote against it. That was far more interesting to me because, and again, they used things like they had one group which was set up by, it was called Recognise a Better Way. And again, it was all people with backgrounds in the Centre for Independent Studies or the Institute of Public Affairs or other organisations from the past they'd set up to block the advance of Aboriginal land rights movement. One was called the Bennelong Society, where they cultivated black voices to attack legitimate black community leaders. And all of these figures turn up again, and then they're saying, one group was saying, oh no, the voice proposal is just not enough. Aboriginal people deserve better. We should vote no now and hope we're getting something better in the future. That persuaded a lot of people. You have a black person saying that on TV.
That's interesting, though, because at the moment, David Seymour's got an agreement from his coalition partners to go to a first reading. But first time I've thought about this, there was enough input, outside voices, outside pressure to get the voice flipped And all really David Seymour and his ilk need to do is flip National, like our biggest political party. Doesn't need to flip the people, and they get to a second reading. Like, and our Prime Minister is very careful with the words he's been choosing. He has ruled out supporting it once or twice, but normally he say things like, we don't want to support it past the first read. And we go, yeah, but we do lots of things we don't want to, Mr. Luxon. Just because you're saying we don't want to support it doesn't mean you're not going to. And we've been saying for a long time on this show, I don't know if it's the same in Australia, but we have a thing called a conscience vote, where the political parties give the right to their MPs to vote as their conscience would, not on party lines. And we're still asking that question, could it be turned into a conscience vote? Then Nationals, not supporting it, just all their MPs are. So we're still wondering about that. But when you say that the voice was flipped, which is obviously what happened, that makes you think for the first time, yeah, so if they can flip just the National Party, not population yet, then they could put this through.
I'll be very, again, I don't know how, I wouldn't want to comment on Mr. Luxon personally, but look, the way it worked here was we had, it came the voice proposal along with a proposal for a truth-telling commission called Makarrata Convention, a bit like the Truth and Justice Commission that happened in South Africa. Because Australia has never formally acknowledged that there was people here before, apart from through the courts, that there was a genocide, so on and so forth. I hope, and out of that, discussions around a treaty, which we still don't have. And now that's all been pushed away, a whole lot, which didn't need to go to a referendum. But they created and the polls were showing 65% support for the voice referendum. And once the Atlas Network through Advance started to pump out their disinformation, I'll be quite happy to call it that, their support crashed. And then the Liberal Party got on board and said, okay, we're going to vote no. And then it was all over. It kept on going down. So I would be very I would be careful about taking too much of that without a pinch of salt.
Yeah. No, I hear you. And I think that the thing that my co-host who's not with us today, Chewy, has been saying that Mr. Seymour, David Seymour, who we're going to look at right now, he has been constantly talking about over the next year. So they've got, he's suggesting there's going to be 12 months of this information going out to people. And it's a long time for a political party not to feel pressure from an external voice and stay the path. So we shall see. Now, look, speaking of David Seymour, I don't want to leave without talking about this clip that he did with Mickey Forbes, because we had you here originally. Well, we have been talking about specifically the Atlas Network. Now, it's a bit of a joke. How do you know when David Seymour's lying? His lips are moving. It's a joke. But certainly this doesn't look like a happy man answering a comfortable question. Lots of blinking. And I just want to play this while you're there. We'll have a look at it. And then I want to get your take on what you see and what you understand of perhaps ACT's direct connection or not to the Atlas Group. Let's have a listen.
We did a story recently on the failure of the yes vote in Australia, which attempted to have Indigenous rights included in their constitution. It failed, but more interestingly, the support for the vote flipped once campaigning began. I think it took about 6 months. And those Indigenous Australians are now warning Māori that the same groups are behind this referendum. Are they, do you think?
Well, if you're about to go into the new Pizzagate of the left conspiracy theory, then I'll be real disappointed.
What's that, the Pizzagate?
That's some crazy conspiracy theory that Trumpists have in the US.
The campaign in Australia had links to the Atlas Network, a network of think tanks which promote individual liberty and free enterprise, and it said that the network pushes opinion pieces in favour of free speech. Do the ACT Party have any links or connections to the Atlas Group?
No.
Have you spoken or taken advice from them or any group associated with them about the treaty? So, recently...
I can't believe you're doing this. I've read about this conspiracy theory and you're actually running it, but that's cool.
Well, no, I'm just trying to understand it because we went to Australia and we analysed the Yes campaign over there, and we spoke with Indigenous people about their fears about what would happen in the referendum. And so when you consider... actually you and I spoke about it. You said that you had met Lord Hannon, and then the TPU, the Taxpayer Union, had invited you to come along, and he spoke about this treaty and the possibility of a referendum. So isn't that, in fact, these movements and these groups talking about our referendum?
What, going along to meet someone who's a famous figure in world politics?
What did he come to New Zealand for?
I have no idea, but I was really
you
pleased.
were there.
I was really pleased to have dinner with the guy. I mean, he's world famous as a politician. You get to meet him, hear what
But
he's
you
got to
went
say.
along to that function to listen to him, where he talked about the Magna Carta and the treaties. And
oh my God, the Magna Carta.
He did, and
Scandalous.
Well, I'm not saying that that's scandalous. I'm just saying this is what he talked about. I listened to it online because it was posted by the TPU, and so he talked about that, and he talked about the danger of the misinterpretation of treaties and what they meant. And and he also says what you say is that the judiciary is getting too involved, or they're making the interpretation of it is too wide.
You do know that people have had concerns about judicial activism.
I think we can leave it there. We've got the gist of what's been going on, talking about Lord Hannon, the Taxpayers Union, and I think perhaps not a mistake by Mahi, but one of the things she didn't say was they asked if ACT had any, quote, links or connections. They never asked if David Seymour had links and connections, because we know that he graduated in 2008 from one of their programs, has done the thing. So maybe they'll say that was still truthful, because maybe they'll say ACT doesn't. But I guess you've just watched it again with me. I'd just throw you the ball. What do you think about what Mr. Seymour had to say?
Well, it's very interesting just how tetchy all of these people are.
Yeah.
They really don't want to talk about it. And that, given that, I've seen that Mr. Seymour was making a speech only a year or two before, where he was talking about how all his great friends in the Atlas Network in Canada.
2021, he talked about them as my very good friends. Yeah, my very good friends, the Atlas Network.
Now, let's just go back. There's plenty of things we can say to answer that question. So much going on in there, and very interesting, all of these denials. So, yes, David Seymour has, I believe, an Atlas think tank MBA, which I had a look at. It's a 2-week course where basically they train their interns, and they're promising think tank directors in how to, as far as I can gather, how to use their internal grant making system, and how to do comms, and how to run a think tank. So how to get money from Atlas benefactors and donors, how to to maintain their funding profile, and how to do their communications and campaigning. Mr. Seymour also has, biographies that were on his Wikipedia page, which have since been removed, show that he was involved around in 2007 to 2014 when he becomes an MP in New Zealand. He's in Canada now. What's he doing in Canada? He's working in 2 Atlas Network think tanks in Canada. One is the Frontier Centre for Public Policy. And interestingly enough, at the time that David Seymour is there, also on the advisory board are Ruth Richardson and Roger Douglas. Roger Douglas, and both of them are members of the Mont Pelerin Society. You have the Roger Douglas, who famously put New Zealand through one of the most radical neoliberalizations, deregulations, and privatization programs. Certainly at that time when it happened, it was remarkably radical and hard shock therapy. And then you have the finance minister, and then a fund minister from National. Both the finance ministers are on this think tank. What does that think tank do? Well, I went and Googled David Seymour the other day, and there was 7 or 8 pages of hits, but apparently they're starting to delete those links now as we speak. But and then he was also with another one called Manning Centre, which is another one. The Canadian Atlas is quite large. And the key object, as far as I can, from my point of view of looking at the history of the petroleum industry, is that there's a great book by Jeff Dembicki called The Petroleum Papers, where he systematically reviews all those archival documents on climate files, which you can look up. There's a ton of primary documents that show that the oil industry knew everything about climate change going back to the 50s. But his argument in that book, Petroleum Papers, is that the oil in Canada is particularly dirty and polluting, right? The oil sands and the tar sands, Athabasca tar sands, they're called. That's the one. And in order for them to dig that up, they have to, it's all kind of soaked into the soil. So they have to get use huge trucks and pile up this oily soil. They have to clear all the forest first, polluted all the rivers to do it. Then they pile it all up, and then they cook this the tar sands with methane, right? With fossil gas, which has to be extracted and piped from somewhere else, and then they have to cook all this soil. So already, even before it goes to the refinery, it's got a huge carbon footprint. And his argument in that book is that the people that were investing there, Shell, Sun, and the Koch brothers own an oil refinery across the US border, which was for a long time, maybe still is, I'm not sure, the only refinery that could process this really dirty sulfurous crude, right? And his argument is that the whole campaign against that climate science isn't real came from Canada. That may be the case. But certainly it was happening everywhere as soon as the oil industry knew that the world knew about climate change and wanted to do something about it. So Canada has and I remember I just mentioned that the first think tank outside of Britain that Anthony Fisher set up was the Fraser Institute, which is the oldest of the Canadian think tanks. Now, Manning is now called Canada Strong and Free, and it's based in the Alberta tar sands, which is the home of the radical reactionary right-wing forces in Canada. Very interesting. And then if we go and have a look at, Mr. Eric Crampton of the NZI, he also has a background in Canada, PhD with the Mercatus Institute at the Koch brothers campus of GMU, right where the Atlas Network headquarters is. And then he worked for a while with the Reform Party of Canada, which was a kind of radical right party, the founder of which is Preston Manning, who, according to the literature which I've looked at, created this new ideology where the common folk, the good ordinary folk, the English-speaking folk, created an identity where they were the oil industry and the common people were one. And anyone that attacked the oil industry was attacking Canadianness, or what I mean. And this is a very common trope that we see now. So you've got this really interesting set of connections with the Atlas people in New Zealand to the Canadian tar sands oil industry. That's all I can say at this point. The other thing and now if we turn to, so why make these denials when they're so obviously, how do we account for Seymour's career between 2007 and
make the denials, and there seems to be a constant theme now coming out from people who don't want to talk about it, that if anyone talks about it, then you are now, the conspiracy theorists are now labeling people who are talking about the Atlas Network as the new conspiracy theorists. So why deny it? And why does it seem with one voice, no matter who you speak to in and around that network group, if you want to talk about them, then you're a conspiracy theorist?
Well, it's very interesting you should say that, because I saw this interview, when it came out, saying Pizzagate for left. I mean, this is the QAnon cult that there's a room full of pedophiles under a pizza shop. A pizza shop with no, but we've got to make sure people know a pizza shop with no basement, but they're under no basement. Yeah, and a guy
turned
up with like a gun. Like, I mean, I read something, some guy turned up with a gun wanting to kill all the pedophiles under the pizza shop, like that's how mental it is. And there was no basement, it's totally made up. Well, all you have to do, to address that is like, well, they used to give this directory away, and then they realized that exposed the whole network, so they hid it. But if you just use the Wayback Machine, you can go and find it. And it's all there. And it's, like the first book that was written about the Institute of Economic Affairs, it's called Thinking the Unthinkable, the Economic Counter-Revolution, published in 95. There's like a whole, 10 pages on the Atlas Network in that book. Like, so it's out there, it's just not well known. And, the evidence is all their own publications, which is, as I mentioned before, they're everywhere. So you just have to ask them about it, keep talking about the Atlas Network, and they'll keep on, I think, tripping over themselves, making these quite strange denials. What are they about labeling those of us talking about it as conspiracy theorists? That seems to be one voice at the moment. Where's that coming from, do you think? Well, I think it's coming from the Atlas headquarters itself. I mean, I saw Seymour said this in the interview. Then Mr. Williams of Taxpayers Union started saying this about my interventions on social media, that I was a conspiracy theorist. I mean, I'm a historian, philosopher of science. I've got, books and publications, I can assure you that I don't think the world's controlled from a Pizzagate basement or something like that. All you have to believe is that the oil industry is the most powerful industry in the world, and they have, the most money. Let's look at the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Let's look at the Koch brothers. Let's look at, the people that own fossil fuel assets tend to be the richest people in the world.
Yeah.
All you have to believe is that they don't want national government to take their profit stream away or regulate them. And, and if democracy is to really do what democracy is supposed to do, that is to a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, well, the first thing that government will do will be shutting down the fossil fuel industry to stop the oceans turning acid and, creating the sixth mass extinction. I mean, that's all scientific. That's all basics. This is science. The oil industry is making the earth uninhabitable, and it doesn't want you to know about that or act on it. So that's all you have to believe. If that's too much, then go back to QAnon. But I want to talk, if you don't mind, briefly about that meeting where Daniel Hannan, Lord Hannan.
Yeah, please.
What happened at this meeting? Well, it's very interesting. So David Sim was there, but just as an onlooker, now,
yeah, the stupidest thing about what he said then was, he said, what was he here to speak about? And David Zuma went, I don't know. It's like, you were fucking sitting there. What did he say? You knew why he was there because you were at the speech where he was saying, but he was like, I don't know what he was there for.
Who is the speaker? So Lord Hannan, will use the given we're great monarchists, us, reflecting to the king and the House of Lords here in the Antipodes. What was this guy? So this fellow is attached with Vote Leave, which was one of the main campaign organisations for the Brexit. Vote Leave is part of the Tufton Street network, which, interestingly enough, doesn't appear on the Atlas directories from 2020, but they have all the same ingredients, right? They staffers who worked at other Atlas think tanks, particularly the Institute of Economic Affairs, were known funding from the fossil fuel industry or for billionaires with significant investments in the fossil fuel industry. There's one called the Global Warming Policy Foundation, which basically, does all the climate denial stuff. And who founded that? Lord Nigel Lawson, who was the guy who privatized the British National Oil Company and basically sold off the public share of BP for very little. So he handed over the UK's oil assets to private global oil companies. The Mont Pelerin Society secretary, the head of the Mont Pelerin Society at the time was also on the board. Now you have John Howard, ex-Australian Prime Minister, who is also a member of the Mont Pelerin Society, on the board. Tony Abbott, who said that climate change was crap when he was in government here and overturned the carbon tax from the previous government. He's on the board. That's Tufton Street. And Hannan, you have a look. DSmog blog is a very good source for those of you who want to find out about all this stuff. According to their page on Lord Hannan, he's spoken at the Cato Institute, which was started by the Koch brothers, of which, is part of the Atlas Network. Heritage Foundation, which was started, the main funder was Richard Mellon Scaife, which is currently preparing a plan to dismantle the entirety of the United States climate policy, and is in league with all the other, they've got a list of the other, independent organizations that are going to help them to do this. And you guess what, they're all part of the Atlas Network. So Lord Hannan does this circuit of climate denial and also, now what was the Brexit all about? Well, it wasn't about Polish carpenters and saving the NHS from immigrants. Obviously, that was the bullshit that was run at the time. And there was a very interesting comment from Jacob Rees-Mogg, whose father was a contemporary of Thatcher at university, ran a newspaper which praised Pinochet, which was the neoliberals' first experiment in, writing a new constitution and reorganizing an economy according to shock therapy. That was under Pinochet in the 70s and 80s. And, anyway, and Jacob Rees-Mogg says it would be great after Brexit we could, because the UK was bound firstly by the European Court of Justice, which upholds the human rights conventions, which are being used in Europe and have been used successfully to force governments to act on climate change. And also the European Union has its own program of decarbonisation. So And then Jacob Rees-Mogg comes out, leader of the Tories, I think on the floor of Commons, or it was certainly at one point. He comes out and says something like, after the Brexit, it will be great. We can get rid of the the pollution control legislation, and it'd be really good for the British economy if our air quality standards were about the same as Delhi in India. So, from my point of view, if we look at what is the fundamental political challenge of our time, which is basically shutting down the fossil fuel industry and replacing it as quickly as we can with non-fossil sources, and that, and again, that's the general pattern, I think, across the whole Atlas network is basically dismantling any democratic or constitutional foothold by which democracy can be used to shut down the fossil fuel industry. Yeah. So if Hannon's here talking, now who was there? Well, the speech itself is interesting. He says, people in British schools, kids going to school now, they know about Martin Luther King and they know about Rosa Parks, but they don't know about John Locke, our great British history. We need to get them back onto who was John Locke? Well, John Locke owned shares in some of the biggest slave trading companies of the day. He was an author of the Carolina Constitution, which basically, asserted the right of property ownership over slaves. Well, this is the person that we want to praise. I mean, that's very interesting, but they'll tell us it's not about division by race. I mean, here's someone they're holding up who quite explicitly said some races should be used as tools for wealth accumulation.
Ownership
of
races.
Who was there? So you see, it's a very interesting speech. So he shouts out to Eric, I presume that was Eric Crampton. He says, I met the New Zealand Initiative this morning. That's the other branch of the Atlas Network. He talks about, this is the guy that basically overturned fundamentally part of Britain's constitutional law, which is its integration with the EU. So again, it's a revolution against the Constitution, a counter-revolution from above against the Constitution. And here he is, and David Simic happens to be in the neighbourhood having listened.
Yeah, whilst he's trying to do a counter-revolution from above to the Treaty of Waitangi.
Okay. And then later on, it turns out I had a look at the website, or someone, pointed it out to me. One of the Atlas think tanks in Australia, the Mankal Foundation in Perth. And each think tank has a specialised role. So you'll have the respectable ones that are very moderate in what they say, but they're doing the behind-the-scenes stuff we can't see. Then you've got the rebel-rousing, radical far-right-wing, shock jock think tank, the IPA here. And then over in Perth, we have the Mankal Institute, which basically recruits and trains people to push them out through the network. So they're given a batch of books to study, which are like, which prove that, we can't intervene in the economy. And even if we like to help the poor, anything we might do to help the poor only makes it worse. And it's just best to, the government has to get out of the way and just secure. So they give them this very concentrated course in simple books produced from within the Atlas network. And then they send them out on, and they give them prizes and build them up and go, look, we're sending you on an all expenses paid trip to the Taxpayers Union in New Zealand. And this guy says the highlight of it's on the website, and it may still be there. They may have taken it down. I don't know. And he says, what was the highlight of your trip? He says, it was great. We went to a party at Alan Gibbs's house and Lord Hannon spoke there. And I was like, oh, okay. So Hannon's there talking about treaty, talking about referendums. He's an expert fixer for Brexit, which kind of, largely was driven by push polling and fake polls, or, non-scientific polls put out by the Institute of Economic Affairs and other Tufton Street Network institutes, and, it's plastered all over the press to give the impression that everybody wants this and it's a popular movement behind it. And then they're at a party at Alan Gibbs's house. Now, Alan Gibbs was on the board of the Sydney Centre of Independent Studies representing New Zealand, at least as early as 1987. I have a pamphlet which I put up on my Twitter account recently with his name on it. And who else is on there? John Bonython, founder of Santos Gas Company, and so on and so on. So it was Alan Gibbs that, was one of the people who helped set up the Atlas in New Zealand. That then advocated for the shock therapy that Roger Douglas brought in, and then benefited from the privatisation of telecom and then Z Forestry and so on, personally. And then his daughter is on the board of the Atlas board in the US, and they're having a party at his house with all the Atlas people.
Yes,
but they're not talking about the treaty. They're not talking about the treaty. David said so.
No, David said he didn't know. I don't know why they were there.
They're not advising him or helping him.
Famous people.
But if it's just his idea, well, where does it come from?
Yeah.
Just him?
We've had you for far too long. I thank you for giving us some extra time today. I want people to know a bit more about how to find your stuff and where to find you at. You've got a bunch of stuff on your uts.edu.au site with lots of information there that they can go and read your stuff. Especially, you were saying earlier, the media stuff that's all there. Times you've been in, done in, written in for media stuff. Is there anything that you can think of? This is a bit of a weird way to end an interview. Anything that you can think of? Or else you can also follow
Is this
Jeremy
the what to do question?
Twitter. No, it's more like, what have we left off? Like, is there anything that we're like? Is there any tidbit or any bit? Because I mean, what we do is we just keep doing what we're doing. I mean, you keep pushing back, you keep fighting. Whether the messaging is coming through a TPU from the Atlas network or it's just coming from the TPU, I think what we keep doing is pushing back and fighting against it, no matter what. Exposing like. The messages that are the same coming from everywhere. You can see political parties doing that. We showed it the other day with two national MPs on different morning television shows, literally both saying exactly the same thing when they were talking about replacing ferries, like the same word. We want a trusty, reliable second-hand Corolla. Now, I'm not suggesting that came from the Atlas network, but you can see it when it comes out. If you keep an eye on what's going on, messages lining up with one another. And when we see it, we'll keep pushing it out. And we often get our viewers and listeners seeing stuff and firing it through to us, and we'll just keep doing that. But is there anything we need to know? Is there a tidbit we've missed out on? We've talked around a lot. I thank you for all your information and the historical context and also the linking of places that we can. Is there anything else to leave us with?
I've got two things I'd like to say. Firstly, from over this side of the ditch, I think there's so much that you can be proud of, that you have, from here, all my heart and solidarity is with the First Nations people of Australia. And they've achieved, they have been blocked and blocked and blocked so many times in their very, dignified requests for justice and recognition. Now, you have this incredible, to me, over here, it's incredible. You have this solidarity among, Pakeha, Maori. I mean, yes, there's always the racist people, but, there is this, and a very successful story also of environmental protection and, the anti-nuclear stuff. The first country in the world that I know of to declare a moratorium, real leadership. And I think that's one of the reasons why why it's so important for the global forces of the far right to squash New Zealand and say, no, you can't get away with this because others might follow. I would be looking at, if I were you, the first thing is that the first rule of the Atlas Network is never talk about the Atlas Network. So if I were you, I was asking...
It's like Fight Club.
Exactly. But that's how they've gotten away with it for so long, is that once you just see, it's just like turning the light on, you can see, oh, okay, this is how it works. Keep asking anybody associated with it. I mean, obviously, you need to know what you're talking about, but just anybody associated. And, we know that they've got offshoots like the New Zealand Centre for Political Research, which is connected to the ACT. The ACT was founded, as far as I know, you may know better, by people around, Roger Douglas and Alan Gibbs, both of whom who've been, thick and thin with the Atlas Network and the neoliberal counter-revolution and the Modern Society going back to at least the mid-70s. So the ACT is an Atlas Network party, as far as I can tell. And why are they denying it? Why aren't they proud of that? Why is Seymour? He spent 7 years working for the Atlas in the oil sands. Why doesn't he want you to know that? Huge gap in it. Is it on his parliamentary CV? I mean, don't they have to show who they are to take high office? I don't know.
Yeah.
There's that. But also just interesting to look at that this kicked off with the Three Waters campaign, where they turned, a campaign around municipal water and environmental regulation.
Fixing our pipes.
Which was a fairly sensible reform. But not only did they, and they tried to whip up racist sentiment around Maori co-governance, but also they sought to try and permanently prevent privatization of your waters. And that's a red rag to the Atlas Pool, because they want everything to be privatized and taken offshore and owned offshore and run for profit and not for public interest. But there's more to the story, and I'll be very happy to hear from anybody who who wants to tell me something that I don't know. But if I were you, I will be I think New Zealand is a very important, unique situation as being the only country that is now talking about the Atlas Network in the midst of an operation where they're trying to assault your constitution. That's never happened before, as far as I know. And so New Zealand could be the first place where they actually get stopped in their tracks. So good luck to you all.
We thank you. We will keep talking about them. Dr. Jeremy Walker on Twitter, if people want to follow. The thing I was going to say, just to wrap up, is you talked about the things like the no nukes and those sorts of things. The difference with what's happening now is all of those policies that the world looks to and goes, oh my God, New Zealand did this and New Zealand did this. They were all under a Labour-led government, all of them. And we now do not have that, which means I get the sense that we won't necessarily have as strong a spine as we had in the first decade of this century saying no to the war in Iraq, or in the 80s saying no to the nukes, or in the 50s or 60s or 50s, whatever it was, with public housing and public health, all Labour, all left-wing governments. Now we've got a right-wing government, and that is quickly and expeditiously trying to cut all the red tape so their funders and friends can do whatever they want. So we'll keep talking about it, how effective that will be on a policy level from the top. I guess history will tell us that, Jeremy.
Certainly. Anyway, keep talking, and I think it will be very interesting to see how this pans out, because, as I said, this could be a real first for that. Again, could be inspiring for people all around the world who are starting to wake up to the fact that so much of their political life is coming from these shadowy, dark-lane think tanks that no one's really paid much attention to in a systematic way before.
That is very true. From the University of Technology in Sydney, that's Dr. Jeremy Walker. Jeremy, it's been great. Thanks so much for joining us.
Appreciate you having me on, Pat.